In 1988, a young British woman set out on what was meant to be a life-defining adventure. She was not running from anything. She was not in trouble. She was not afraid. She was following a lifelong passion that had shaped who she was from childhood. Within weeks, she would vanish in one of the most famous wildlife reserves in the world, and her disappearance would ignite one of the most controversial true crime cases in African history. Her name was Julie Ward. Julie Ann Ward was born on April 20th, 1960, in Suffolk, England. She was the eldest child in a close-knit family, raised alongside her two younger brothers, Tim and Bob, by her parents, John and Jan Ward. Her upbringing was stable and supportive. Her father was a successful businessman in the hospitality industry, owning and operating a chain of hotels that allowed the family to live comfortably. But despite financial security, Julie was never sheltered or entitled. From an early age, Julie displayed a gentle curiosity about the world. She was known for her kindness, her intelligence, and her quiet independence. Animals fascinated her, and nature was where she felt most at peace. Photography soon became her creative outlet, a way for her to document the beauty she saw around her. Friends and family later said that Julie did not simply take photographs. She observed, waited, and connected with her surroundings. By her late 20s, Julie was working as a publishing assistant in England. It was a stable job, but it did not fulfill her. She wanted more than routine. She wanted experience, movement, and meaning. And so, at the age of 28, she made a decision that would change everything. Julie took a year off from her career to travel through Africa. Her plan was ambitious but carefully thought out. She joined a 7-month overland expedition that would take her across several countries, ending in Kenya. Her primary goal was to photograph African wildlife, especially the great wildebeest migration in the Masai Mara, one of the most extraordinary natural events on Earth. On the 7th of February 1988, Julie left England as part of a group of 26 travelers. She was excited, optimistic, and well prepared. She wrote letters home describing her experiences, her encounters with wildlife, and the friendships she was forming along the way. There was no indication of fear or distress. On the contrary, Julie appeared to be thriving. By mid-year, Julie arrived in Kenya and settled in Nairobi. It was there that she met Paul and Natasha Dixon, an elderly British couple who owned a large estate on the outskirts of the city. They often rented out their land as a campsite for travelers passing through. The couple took a liking to Julie almost immediately. She shared their love for dogs, nature, and quiet conversation. Julie camped on their property for much of July and later rented a nearby cottage in August. During this time, she became familiar with the area and began making plans for her final weeks in Kenya before returning home to England. Her return flight was booked. Her family was expecting her. On the 2nd of September 1988, Julie set out for the Masai Mara with an Australian biologist named Glenn Burns. The two shared an interest in wildlife and had agreed to travel together to observe the annual migration. Julie had purchased a second-hand Suzuki Jeep in Nairobi, giving her independence and flexibility as she moved through the country. They camped at Sand River Campground, located deep within the Masai Mara Game Reserve. The area was remote but well known to park staff, rangers, and experienced travelers. The following day, their plans were disrupted when Julie's Jeep broke down near Mara Serena Lodge. A tour truck driven by a man named Stephen Watson came across the stranded vehicle and towed it to the lodge. The problem was traced to a faulty fuel pump. Unfortunately, repairs could not be completed immediately. Glenn Burns had professional obligations back in Nairobi and needed to attend a conference at the Nairobi Museum. The following day, he flew out, leaving Julie behind at the lodge. Before departing, he took the damaged fuel pump with him and promised to send a replacement as soon as possible. Julie remained at the Mara Serena Lodge, waiting. The replacement fuel pump arrived on the 5th of September, but it came too late in the day for repairs to be completed. Julie spent one more night at the lodge. According to staff and guests, she appeared calm and in good spirits. There was no sign of panic or concern. At around midday on the 6th of September, Julie finally left Mara Serena Lodge. Her plan was simple. She intended to drive to Sand River Campground to collect the 2 tents she and Glenn had left behind several days earlier. After retrieving her equipment, she planned to head back toward Nairobi. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Julie arrived at Sand River Campground. She dismantled the tents and paid additional camping fees. A campground clerk named David Nchoko later stated that he saw her during this time. A police constable stationed nearby, Gerald Karori, also claimed to have interacted with her. At around 2:30 in the afternoon, Julie left the campground, driving her Jeep alone in the direction of Kikorok Lodge, the route she would need to take to reach Nairobi. That was the last confirmed sighting of Julie Ward. She never arrived back in Nairobi. She never returned to the Well-Dixons property, and she never boarded her flight home to England. As night fell on the 6th of September, concern began to grow. As the 6th of September came to an end, no one immediately realized that something was wrong. Julie Ward was an experienced traveler. She had spent months moving through unfamiliar countries, navigating long distances and unexpected delays. A missed evening or a late arrival did not automatically raise alarm. But by the morning of the 7th of September, concern began to grow. Julie was expected back at the Well-Dixons property near Nairobi. She had spoken openly about her plans, mentioning that she would collect her camping gear and then return. When she did not arrive that evening, Paul and Natasha Well-Dixon assumed she had been delayed on the road. Travel in Kenya was unpredictable, and mechanical issues were not uncommon. By the next day, however, worry turned into unease. Julie still had not appeared. She had not called. She had not sent word. She had not returned to the cottage she had rented nearby. The Well-Dixons began making inquiries, contacting hospitals and police stations along the Nairobi, Masai Mara route. They feared the possibility of a road accident or another breakdown in a remote area. No one had seen her. When the 10th of September arrived and Julie failed to board her scheduled flight back to England, there was no longer any doubt. Something was seriously wrong. The Well-Dixons formally reported Julie missing and immediately contacted her father, John Ward, in England. For John, the call marked the beginning of a nightmare that would consume the rest of his life. John boarded the first available flight to Kenya, arriving on the 12th of September 1988. By the time he landed, his daughter had been missing for 6 days. Local authorities had conducted no organized search. No helicopters had been deployed. No coordinated effort had been launched. John quickly realized that if Julie was going to be found, he would have to take matters into his own hands. Using his own money, John organized a private search operation. With the help of the Well-Dixons and friends Julie had made during her time in Kenya, he chartered 5 aircraft to search the vast expanse of the Masai Mara Reserve. The area was enormous, covering thousands of square kilometers of open plains, riverbeds, and dense bush. The search began immediately. Pilots flew low over dirt tracks, dry riverbeds, and remote areas far from tourist routes. John clung to the hope that Julie's Jeep had broken down again and that she was waiting somewhere for help. The emergency message scratched into the dust on the roof of the Jeep had not yet been discovered, but John believed his daughter was resourceful and strong. On Tuesday, the 13th of September, the search yielded a breakthrough. Julie's Suzuki Jeep was spotted from the air and later confirmed on the ground. It was abandoned in a gully near a stream known as Makindu, deep inside the Masai Mara Reserve. The location was puzzling. The vehicle was off the main road, in an area that was difficult to access and not commonly traveled. Police were notified immediately. Inside the Jeep were several personal items: a map, binoculars, bottles of beer, and other belongings. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no visible blood, no immediate explanation for why Julie would have driven into such terrain. Then John noticed something that gave him a flicker of hope. On the roof of the vehicle, traced into the dust, were three letters: an emergency signal, a plea for help. For John, this suggested that Julie might still be alive. Perhaps the Jeep had broken down again. Perhaps she had walked away from the vehicle in search of assistance. Perhaps she had been forced to leave the area under circumstances no one yet understood. That hope would not last long. Later that same day, the chief game warden of the Masai Mara Reserve, Simon O'Macalla, reported finding a suspicious site near the Alemutic Gate. There, he claimed to have come across the remains of a burned-out campfire. Within the ashes were human remains. When John Ward arrived at the scene, the reality became impossible to deny. Among the blackened debris were fragments of a left leg, part of a jawbone, sections of the spinal column, and a lock of hair. The rest of the body appeared to have been destroyed by fire. A skull would later be found in nearby bushes weeks afterward. John would later describe the scene as overwhelming. The fire pit was several feet wide. The smell was unmistakable. There were remnants of personal items, including a mug, burned sunglasses, and damaged film canisters. The ground was blackened and oily, with a faint smell of fuel lingering in the air. Despite the devastation, there were no signs of a struggle at the site. No drag marks, no large amounts of blood. The scene raised more questions than answers. A post-mortem examination was ordered. The first autopsy was conducted by Kenyan police pathologist Dr. Adel Shaker. His findings were deeply troubling. He concluded that the remains belonged to Julie Ward and noted that the leg and jaw showed clean cuts consistent with the use of a sharp instrument. He also found evidence that the remains had been deliberately burned, likely using petrol. Dr. Shaker concluded that Julie's death was a homicide. Yet almost immediately, his conclusion was challenged. Authorities proposed alternative explanations, suggesting that Julie may have been struck by lightning and later mauled by wild animals. The theory was difficult to reconcile with the condition of the remains, but it was nevertheless put forward as an official narrative. When John Ward later obtained a copy of the autopsy report, he made a disturbing discovery. Key phrases had been altered. Words describing the injuries as cleanly cut had been crossed out or replaced with terms such as torn and cracked. The changes shifted the interpretation away from human involvement and toward animal activity. John confronted officials. He demanded answers. Dr. Shaker would later confirm that his report had been altered by his superior, Dr. Jason Kavidi, a senior medical officer and advisor to the Kenyan government. According to Shaker, Kavidi dismissed his conclusions as mere opinion and insisted on revisions. Julie's remains were eventually returned to England, where a second post-mortem examination was carried out by Professor Austin Gresham. His conclusions echoed Dr. Shaker's original findings. The injuries were consistent with a deliberate killing, involving sharp force trauma and decapitation from behind. Despite two medical professionals reaching the same conclusion, Kenyan authorities refused to open a homicide investigation. For John Ward, the fight for truth was only just beginning. With his daughter's remains returned to England and two separate post-mortem examinations pointing toward homicide, John Ward believed that justice would finally follow. Instead, he was met with resistance, denial, and a pattern of official indifference that would come to define the next 3 decades of his life. Kenyan investigators continued to reject the conclusion that Julie Ward had been murdered. Rather than treating the case as a criminal investigation, authorities appeared determined to explain it away. Suggestions emerged that Julie had been depressed, that she had harmed herself, or that wild animals were responsible for the injuries found on her remains. These claims stunned those who knew Julie. Friends, family, and fellow travelers described her as optimistic, focused, and excited about returning home. She had booked her flight. She had made plans. There was no history of mental health struggles, no farewell messages, and no indication of despair. Yet these narratives persisted. During early inquiries, the senior police officer assigned to the case, Superintendent Mukri Wanjau, made comments that would later haunt the investigation. According to Dr. Adele Shaker, Wanjau suggested that Julie was morally loose and implied that her character somehow explained her death. He spoke of the possibility that Julie had taken her own life and even suggested she had dismembered herself and set a fire that spread. To John Ward, these statements were not just offensive. They were a deliberate attempt to shift blame onto the victim and away from any serious examination of the evidence. As pressure mounted, an inquest into Julie Ward's death was convened in Nairobi. The proceedings brought uncomfortable contradictions into the open. Dr. Jason Kavidi was questioned about the alterations made to the autopsy report. He defended his actions by claiming that Dr. Shaker's command of English was poor and that changes were necessary for clarity. However, under further questioning, Kavidi admitted that out of hundreds of reports Dr. Shaker had written, this was the only one that had required such intervention. Professor Austin Gresham testified during the inquest, reinforcing the conclusion that Julie's injuries were inflicted deliberately. He stated that the damage to her jaw and skull indicated she had been decapitated from behind with a sharp blade. The magistrate overseeing the inquest ultimately ruled that Julie Ward had been unlawfully killed by person or persons unknown. But then came a decision that stunned John and many observers. The magistrate ruled that no further investigation was required. For John Ward, this moment marked a turning point. It was clear that local authorities had no intention of pursuing the truth. If justice was ever going to be achieved, it would have to come from outside Kenya. In February of 1990, after persistent lobbying by John, the British Foreign Secretary authorized Scotland Yard to conduct an independent inquiry into Julie Ward's death. British investigators traveled to Kenya, bringing with them renewed hope. The Scotland Yard team began reviewing evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and reconstructing Julie's final movements. Their attention quickly turned to the Sand River campground, where Julie had last been seen. Two individuals stood out: the campground clerk, David Nchoko, and police constable Gerald Karori. Both men had claimed to see Julie leave the campground alone at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon on the 6th of September. However, Scotland Yard investigators uncovered a troubling inconsistency. Julie's signature in the park's gate register did not match known samples of her handwriting. Handwriting experts confirmed that the signature was a forgery. Under questioning, David Nchoko eventually admitted that Julie had not signed herself out of the reserve. He confessed that he had filled in her details and signed her name after she left. He claimed that he did so not to mislead investigators, but because he had forgotten to have her sign the register and feared disciplinary action. While this explanation raised serious concerns, it did not conclusively prove criminal involvement. Scotland Yard investigators also focused on two park rangers, Peter Kipping and John Madgeroy, who had been on duty in the Masai Mara on the day Julie disappeared. Evidence suggested that Julie had been stopped at a gate post, placing her in proximity to the rangers. Charges were brought. However, the case quickly began to unravel in court. Witness testimony conflicted, timelines blurred, physical evidence was scarce. Despite lingering suspicions, all four men, the two rangers, the clerk, and the police constable, were ultimately acquitted due to insufficient evidence. Once again, the case stalled. Years passed, but the questions remained. In 1998, renewed scrutiny fell on a figure who had been present from the very beginning, Chief Game Warden Simon Macalla. Investigators began to examine his actions on the day Julie's Jeep was found, and what they discovered raised unsettling doubts. Macalla had been informed of the Jeep's discovery at around 11 in the morning. Rather than immediately overseeing a ground search, he drove in the opposite direction, traveling approximately 50 kilometers to Mara Serena Lodge. By the time he arrived at the gully in mid-afternoon, more than 30 people, including rangers, police officers, and council workers, had already been there and left. Police had removed Julie's personal belongings from the Jeep hours earlier and transported them to the Sand River Police Post for safekeeping. Yet during later testimony, Macalla claimed that when he arrived, he looked inside the vehicle and saw items that should no longer have been there. Investigators noted that this suggested prior knowledge. Further suspicions emerged when the terrain was examined. The Jeep had been driven off a relatively safe road and into rough, trackless bush before coming to rest in a deep gully near a stream. For an experienced traveler, this decision made little sense. Macalla insisted that he did not drive and had never driven a vehicle. Witnesses contradicted him. Several individuals, including his own driver, stated that Macalla often drove. Records were later found documenting a motor accident involving a vehicle he had been driving. Even John Ward recalled being driven by Macalla during the early days of the search. The more investigators looked, the more inconsistencies emerged. And then there was the discovery of Julie's remains. Macalla had radioed at 26 minutes past 4 in the afternoon to report finding the burned remains. Records showed that he had left the gully where the Jeep was located at 4 o'clock. The distance between the two sites was approximately 10 kilometers. Investigators retraced the route. The journey took exactly 26 minutes. The timing of Simon Macalla's movements that afternoon became one of the most troubling elements in the entire case. According to official records, Macalla departed the gully where Julie Ward's Jeep had been found at precisely 4 o'clock in the afternoon. At 26 minutes past 4, he radioed in to say that he had discovered Julie's remains. The distance between the two locations was just over 10 kilometers, through a desolate and largely unmarked section of the Masai Mara. When investigators later retraced the route, they found that the journey took exactly 26 minutes. This meant that Macalla would have had to drive directly from the Jeep to the site where Julie's remains were found, without hesitation, without getting lost, and without searching randomly. The area where the remains were located was not easily identifiable. There were no tracks leading to it, no visible paths. It was hidden among dozens of trees and bushes, distinguishable only by one unusually shaped large tree in the distance. To many, this raised a disturbing question. How did Macalla know where to go? Macalla insisted that his discovery had been pure chance. He claimed that he had been guided by vultures circling in the sky. But this explanation quickly fell apart. Witnesses and investigators pointed out that, at that distance, even large animals such as elephants would have been difficult to spot, let alone birds circling far above the landscape. The suggestion that vultures had led him directly to the remains was widely regarded as implausible. Further doubt was cast by the fact that when Macalla arrived at the Jeep later that afternoon, he claimed to have seen items inside the vehicle that had already been removed by police hours earlier. Maps, binoculars, bottles of beer, and a pair of trainers had all been taken to the Sand River Police Post for safekeeping. Yet Macalla listed these items in his account as though he had seen them personally. Investigators concluded that he must have had prior information about the contents of the vehicle. There were also questions about Macalla's behavior earlier that day. At 11 o'clock in the morning, when he was first informed that a vehicle matching Julie's Jeep had been spotted, He did not immediately mobilize the 113 Rangers under his command to conduct a ground search. Instead, he drove away from the scene, traveling 50 kilometers in the opposite direction to Mara Serena Lodge. Only hours later did he return. By then, the area had already been accessed by numerous individuals. The potential crime scene had been compromised beyond repair. As scrutiny intensified, Makala's credibility continued to erode. Despite his claims that he did not drive vehicles, multiple witnesses came forward stating that he frequently drove, sometimes even taking the wheel from his own driver. Records confirmed that he had been involved in a motor accident while driving. Still, nothing could be definitively proven. During the trial of the park rangers years earlier, Makala had testified confidently, but his statements were increasingly viewed as misleading at best. Investigators believed that while he may not have directly killed Julie Ward, he likely played a role in concealing the truth. Public speculation grew. Behind closed doors, some whispered that Makala had been ordered to clean up the aftermath of a crime committed by someone far more powerful. That speculation intensified when Makala's behavior following the discovery of Julie's remains came under review. A Swiss television crew had been assisting in the search for Julie, offering 5 radio-equipped vehicles to help cover ground more efficiently. Instead of welcoming their support, Makala reportedly told them to mind their own business and leave the area. The crew later said they had heard rumors circulating within the reserve about a politically connected individual being present in the park around the time Julie disappeared. They documented their account in Makala's office before leaving Kenya. According to their statement, Makala appeared visibly distressed. He sat with his head in his hands and mentioned that he had been summoned to a meeting with President Daniel Arap Moi. Shortly after Julie's remains were discovered, Makala disappeared from his post. At first, authorities claimed he was on leave. Later, it emerged that he had been suspended. He never returned to his position as senior warden of the Masai Mara Game Reserve. As doubts surrounding Makala deepened, John Ward continued his own investigation. He spoke to anyone willing to talk: lodge staff, rangers, local villagers, tour guides. Some were cautious, others were terrified. One afternoon, while staying at Kikorok Lodge, John encountered a woman who would leave a lasting impression on him. She approached him quietly and said words that would echo in his mind for years to come. "The man who killed your daughter is Jonathan Moi." Jonathan Moi was the son of Kenya's then president, Daniel Arap Moi. At first, the allegation seemed unthinkable. The implications were enormous, but as John continued digging, he began to hear the name again and again. Rumors circulated throughout the park and nearby villages. Some claimed Jonathan Moi had been seen in the reserve with a group of men around the time Julie disappeared. Others spoke of government vehicles, restricted areas, and unspoken rules. Then came a letter. Sent anonymously from Kenya to the United Kingdom, the letter described an incident from early September 1988. The writer claimed to have been working at Kikorok Lodge at the time. She described standing near the lodge's petrol station, waiting for transport home, when she witnessed 3 men dragging a white woman from a Land Rover into the government guest house. The guest house was reserved exclusively for heads of state and VIPs. The woman said she did not intervene. She was afraid, but she never forgot what she had seen. The allegations were explosive, yet still circumstantial. Then, years later, another voice emerged. In 1992, a man named Valentine Uhuru Kodipo gave an interview in which he claimed to be part of a secret militia allegedly funded by the Kenyan government. He stated that Julie Ward had been killed on the orders of Jonathan Moi. According to Kodipo, Julie had been assaulted and murdered in the presence of others. He said the crime had been covered up to protect powerful interests. The Kenyan government denied the existence of any such militia and rejected Kodipo's claims outright. But Kodipo did not back down. In 1995, he repeated his allegations in an interview with a British newspaper, stating once again that he had witnessed Julie's killing. Jonathan Moi denied everything. He claimed he had been on his family farm in Eldama Ravine, hundreds of kilometers away, at the time of Julie's death. He said he had never met Julie Ward and had no involvement in her disappearance. No investigation followed. The lack of action only deepened suspicion. As the years passed, some suggested that Julie may have stumbled upon something she was never meant to see. Others speculated that she may have taken photographs of restricted areas or illegal operations within the reserve. There were even rumors that she had unknowingly documented militia camps. None of these theories were ever proven. But one thing became increasingly clear. Julie Ward's case was no longer just about one missing traveler. It had become entangled with politics, power, and fear. And John Ward refused to let it be forgotten. As the years passed, the silence surrounding Julie Ward's death only seemed to grow louder. Official channels had closed, courtrooms had emptied, suspects had been cleared, yet beneath the surface the case refused to rest. John Ward continued to return to Kenya, time and time again, driven by a belief that someone, somewhere, knew the truth. By the mid-1990s, the investigation had shifted almost entirely into John's hands. He funded his own inquiries, hired private investigators, consulted forensic experts, and followed leads that authorities had long abandoned. With each visit, he gathered fragments of information, small, unsettling details that, when viewed together, suggested a far more complex story than the official version allowed. In 1997, the Directorate of Criminal Investigations in Kenya announced that a new team would review Julie Ward's case. For the first time in years, there was renewed hope that accountability might finally follow. As part of this review, Simon Makala was formally charged with Julie's murder. Prosecutors alleged that Makala had lied about his knowledge of the contents of Julie's Jeep, misled investigators about the timing and circumstances of his discovery of her remains, and played a role in concealing the crime. It was argued that even if he had not killed Julie himself, he had obstructed justice and protected those responsible. During the trial, the prosecution laid out a timeline that contradicted Makala's testimony. They highlighted the impossibility of his chance discovery of the remains and the improbability of his movements that afternoon. They pointed to his failure to initiate a timely search and his apparent foreknowledge of evidence. Despite this, the case once again fell apart. The court ruled that while Makala's actions were suspicious, there was not enough direct evidence to prove he had murdered Julie Ward. He was acquitted. For John Ward, it was another devastating blow. But even as legal avenues closed, new information continued to surface. In 2004, investigators were approached by an unnamed witness who claimed to have seen an armed man in military-style clothing sitting inside Julie's Jeep around the time she disappeared. The witness said the man did not appear to be a ranger and that his presence suggested Julie had not been alone. The statement was recorded, but no charges followed. Around the same time, John received information from a former Kenyan intelligence officer who agreed to speak anonymously. The officer claimed to have witnessed Julie's murder from a distance. According to his account, 3 men assaulted and killed her within the reserve. He described how Julie had been forced to drive her Jeep away from Sand River campground under threat. Once they reached a remote area, she was made to write an emergency signal on the roof of her vehicle, creating the illusion of an accident. The men then took her elsewhere. The officer said fear had kept him silent for years. Even decades later, he remained afraid to reveal his identity. As disturbing as the account was, It aligned with details that had long troubled investigators: the location of the Jeep, the staged emergency message, and the absence of struggle at the site where the vehicle was found. Another name continued to resurface during John's investigation: Ibrahim Choj. According to multiple sources, Ibrahim was the farm manager of Jonathan Moi and was married to one of President Moi's daughters. He was described as a close associate of Jonathan and was allegedly present in the Masai Mara on the day Julie disappeared. One informant claimed that on the 6th of September 1988, Julie encountered Jonathan Moi and his entourage while driving through the reserve. What began as a conversation reportedly turned aggressive. The informant alleged that Julie was assaulted and that Jonathan, fearing exposure, ordered his bodyguards to kill her. The informant provided names, locations, and relationships. He said Ibrahim Chode witnessed the assault and later distanced himself from Jonathan, deeply troubled by what had happened. According to this account, Ibrahim once confronted Jonathan during an argument, shouting that one day he would expose him for what he had done in the Mara. In 1999, Ibrahim Choj died in what authorities described as a car accident. But his family did not believe that explanation. When John Ward later met Ibrahim's father, he was told a very different story. Ibrahim's father claimed that an autopsy revealed marks on his son's wrists consistent with restraint and extensive bruising to his body. The injuries suggested he had been beaten severely, suffering fatal internal damage. A witness reportedly saw a wooden log placed across the road, forcing Ibrahim's car to crash. After the accident, she saw him retrieve a briefcase from the vehicle before being attacked by 3 hooded men. At the time, she believed it was a robbery. Despite these claims, Ibrahim's death was officially ruled an accident. To John Ward, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Witnesses who knew too much disappeared, stories were dismissed, evidence was lost, and powerful names were never officially questioned. In 2012, John published a detailed report in Nairobi Law Monthly. In it, he laid out the evidence he had gathered over nearly 25 years. He named Jonathan Moi as the man he believed responsible for his daughter's murder. The report sent shockwaves through Kenya and beyond. John revealed that in 2009, former Superintendent Mukri Wanjo, the same officer who had once suggested Julie's death was self-inflicted, had contacted him. Wan claimed that during his earlier investigation, he had come to suspect Jonathan Moi. According to Wanjo, when he raised these suspicions with his superiors, he was told to look elsewhere. He said he was forced to change his conclusions and avoid any mention of murder. Wanjo also claimed that Simon Makala had not killed Julie, but had been instructed to dispose of the body. He said he wanted to meet John again and share documents that could expose many people. That meeting never happened. Not long afterward, John was informed that Wanjo had died. By this point, more than 2 decades had passed since Julie Ward vanished. Her case remained officially unsolved, but for John Ward, the truth had become painfully clear. He was no longer searching for answers. He was searching for accountability. By the time John Ward published his findings, his investigation had become one of the most exhaustive private inquiries ever undertaken by a victim's family. For more than 2 decades, he had pursued leads across continents, documented testimony that others were too afraid to record, and preserved evidence that he feared would otherwise vanish forever. He was no longer just a grieving father. He had become the custodian of his daughter's case. In his report, John detailed information provided by an informant who claimed to have once been closely associated with Jonathan Moi. This individual presented photographs showing himself in Jonathan's company and described his proximity to the powerful inner circle surrounding the Moi family. According to the informant, on the 6th of September 1988, Jonathan Moi, accompanied by bodyguards, a driver, and his farm manager Ibrahim Choj, encountered Julie Ward while traveling through the Masai Mara reserve. The informant alleged that Julie was stopped along the route and questioned. What happened next, according to the account, was devastating. The conversation reportedly escalated. Julie was assaulted. The informant claimed that those present realized that if Julie reported the incident, it would create a scandal of international proportions. The decision was allegedly made to silence her. The informant said Jonathan ordered his bodyguards to kill Julie. Her body was later burned. Her vehicle was staged to resemble a breakdown. Evidence was manipulated. Those involved were protected. The informant provided names of the bodyguards, the driver, and the farm manager. He claimed that Ibrahim Choj was deeply disturbed by what he had witnessed and later distanced himself from Jonathan. Years later, Ibrahim would be dead. John Ward believed these events were connected. In 2004, further information emerged when a former Kenyan intelligence officer gave an anonymous interview to a local newspaper. The officer claimed that he had personally witnessed Julie's murder, but had been too afraid to intervene or speak publicly. He described how Julie had been forced to drive her Jeep away from Sand River campground under armed escort. Once the Jeep was positioned in a remote gully, she was instructed to write an emergency message on the roof to suggest mechanical failure. She was then taken elsewhere and killed. The officer said he had lived in fear ever since. John documented this testimony, adding it to the growing body of evidence that pointed toward a coordinated effort rather than an isolated act of violence. Despite this, no official investigation was reopened. In 2018, John made one final formal appeal. He requested that Kenyan authorities obtain a DNA sample from Jonathan Moi to compare against preserved evidence. John had kept biological material in his own freezer for years, unwilling to trust it to systems he believed were compromised. Nothing came of the request. A year later, Jonathan Moi died of pancreatic cancer. 2 months after that, former President Daniel Arap Moi also passed away. With their deaths, John believed that fear might finally loosen its grip. He hoped that those who had remained silent for decades would now feel safe enough to speak, but time was not on his side. John Ward had dedicated 35 years to his pursuit of justice. He made more than 200 trips to Kenya, spending over £2 million of his personal wealth. He interviewed witnesses, followed rumors into remote villages, excavated latrines near the site where Julie's remains were found, and refused to accept official conclusions that contradicted the evidence. He preserved documents, he kept recordings, he saved DNA. His life became defined by the question of what happened to his daughter. On the 7th of June, 2023, John Ward passed away, just weeks after the death of his wife Jan, who had been laid to rest on the 25th of May. For those who knew him, it felt as though his fight had ended not in resolution, but in exhaustion. Yet the story did not end with him. Julie's brothers, Tim and Bob, publicly stated that they would continue their father's mission. They pledged to keep Julie's name alive and to pursue the truth wherever it might lead. They inherited not only his files, but his determination. Today, Julie Ward's case remains unresolved. No one has ever been convicted for her murder. Official explanations remain contested. Witnesses remain unnamed. Evidence remains disputed. What is undeniable is this: a young woman traveled to Kenya with a camera and a dream. She never came home, and those with the power to investigate her death repeatedly chose not to. Her story exposes uncomfortable questions about justice, influence, and whose lives are deemed worthy of protection. It is a case that refuses to fade. Because unanswered questions do not disappear with time. They wait. As the years moved on, Julie Ward's case settled into a strange and unsettling place. It was no longer an active investigation, yet it was never truly closed. It lived in court transcripts, faded newspaper clippings, private testimonies, and the memories of those who had crossed paths with her during her final days. For John Ward, the absence of resolution was not silence. It was noise. Every inconsistency echoed. Every unanswered question demanded attention. He revisited Julie's final route again and again, walking the same ground, measuring distances, standing where her jeep had been found, and imagining the choices she would have faced in those final hours. Over time, one conclusion became unavoidable. Julie's disappearance could not be explained by chance. Experienced travelers rarely abandon safe roads. Julie knew the risks of off-road driving in the reserve. She understood wildlife behavior, terrain, and isolation. The decision to leave the main track and drive into rough bushland toward a deep gully made no sense unless she had been forced or coerced. That belief was reinforced by the absence of mechanical failure when the jeep was examined. The vehicle could have been driven out of the gully. There was no evidence that it was immobilized. And yet, there it sat, deliberately placed, as though someone wanted it found, but not too soon. The emergency message written on the roof deepened the mystery. Julie was methodical and precise. The letters were clear, deliberate, and unmistakable. If she had written them, it meant she believed someone would see them. It suggested urgency, but also control. John came to believe that the message had not been written freely. The idea that Julie had been forced to stage a distress signal aligned with multiple accounts that emerged years later. It also explained why there were no footprints leading away from the vehicle and no sign of struggle at the scene. The real violence, John believed, had happened elsewhere. Another unresolved element was the burning of Julie's body. Fire destroys evidence. It removes identifiers. It delays certainty. The use of accelerants suggested planning, not panic. It was not the act of a wild animal or an accident. It was deliberate. And yet, the location where the remains were found appeared almost chosen for secrecy. Hidden, isolated, and difficult to reach without precise knowledge of the terrain. That knowledge, John believed, belonged to someone familiar with the reserve. Throughout his investigation, John encountered fear again and again. Potential witnesses would lower their voices, glance around, or abruptly change the subject. Some refused to speak at all. Others asked not to be named, even decades later. Several told him the same thing in different ways. There were names that could not be spoken. The involvement of powerful individuals created an invisible barrier. Even when information surfaced, it stalled before reaching official channels. Files disappeared. Promises were broken. Meetings were canceled. John documented it all. He also examined the conduct of the original investigation. The failure to immediately secure Julie's jeep, the removal of items before forensic analysis, the delay in initiating a ground search, the altered autopsy report. Each misstep weakened the case. Together, they destroyed it. Whether through incompetence or intention, the result was the same. Justice was denied. Despite the frustration, John never allowed anger to consume him. Those who met him described a man who was calm, methodical, and deeply respectful of Julie's memory. He did not seek revenge. He sought truth. Julie, he believed, deserved that much. He also understood that time was working against him. Memories faded. Witnesses aged. Records deteriorated. With every passing year, the chances of prosecution diminished. Still, he pressed on. He spoke at universities. He collaborated with journalists. He gave interviews to international media. He refused to let the case disappear into obscurity. And slowly, public perception began to shift. What was once dismissed as a tragic accident came to be seen as something far darker. Independent observers questioned the lightning strike theory. Forensic experts challenged the animal attack explanation. Investigative journalists revisited testimony that had been ignored. Julie Ward's name became synonymous with a case that symbolized the limits of accountability. For John, that recognition was bittersweet. Awareness did not equal justice, but it kept the door open. In private moments, John admitted that his greatest fear was not that the truth would never be known, but that it would be known and still ignored. That fear followed him until the end. Yet even in his final years, he continued to believe that someone, somewhere, would speak. Because secrets are heavy, and carrying them for a lifetime comes at a cost. In the years following John Ward's passing, the weight of his work became even more apparent. What he left behind was not simply a collection of notes or accusations, but a detailed archive built over decades: interviews, timelines, forensic opinions, and correspondence that told a story far more complex than the one preserved in official records. For many who revisited the case after his death, one question stood out above all others: how could so many warning signs have been ignored for so long? From the very beginning, Julie Ward's disappearance contained elements that should have triggered an immediate and aggressive investigation. A young foreign traveler vanished in a protected game reserve. Her vehicle was found abandoned in an unusual location. Her remains showed evidence of deliberate harm, yet at every critical juncture, the response fell short. The early hours were lost. The crime scene was compromised. The autopsy report was altered. Witness statements were accepted without scrutiny. Each failure narrowed the path to justice. Experts who later reviewed the case pointed out that, even without political considerations, the handling of the investigation would have made a successful prosecution nearly impossible. By the time outside authorities became involved, too much time had passed, and too much evidence had been contaminated or destroyed. But many believed the failures were not accidental. Julie Ward's case unfolded at a time when Kenya's tourism industry was a critical source of revenue, and international reputation mattered deeply. A highly publicized murder of a foreign tourist in one of the country's most famous reserves would have carried enormous consequences. John Ward openly accused the government of prioritizing image over truth. Whether that accusation was fair or not, the outcome remained unchanged. No one was held accountable. As interest in the case resurfaced periodically, new generations encountered Julie's story for the first time. Documentary filmmakers, journalists, and independent researchers examined the evidence and reached similar conclusions. The official explanations did not align with the facts. The lightning strike theory was widely dismissed as implausible. The animal attack explanation failed to account for the clean cuts to bone and the use of fire. The idea that Julie had taken her own life was contradicted by her plans, her behavior, and the lack of any supporting evidence. What remained was a scenario involving human intervention, planning, control, and concealment. Julie's final hours were reconstructed repeatedly, each version pointing toward coercion rather than accident. The positioning of the Jeep, the emergency message, the absence of footprints, the separation of the body from the vehicle, none of it suggested randomness. It suggested intent. For Tim and Bob Ward, continuing their father's work was both a responsibility and a burden. They inherited decades of grief, unanswered questions, and unresolved anger, not just toward those suspected of involvement, but toward systems that failed to protect their sister. They spoke publicly about Julie not only as a victim but as a person, a woman who loved animals, a photographer who respected nature, a traveler who trusted the world. They emphasized that her story was not about politics or power, but about accountability. As the years passed, the possibility of legal justice faded. Suspects died, witnesses disappeared, Statutes and jurisdictional barriers hardened, but moral accountability remained. Julie Ward's case became a symbol of what happens when truth is inconvenient. It raised uncomfortable questions about whose lives are protected, whose voices are believed, and how easily justice can be delayed until it no longer arrives at all. Yet even without resolution, the story continued to matter. Because unresolved cases do not belong only to the past, they shape how future cases are handled, they expose weaknesses, they demand better. For those who followed Julie's story, her name became a reminder that silence is not neutrality, it is a choice. And choices have consequences. Julie Ward's story does not end with a courtroom verdict or a confession. It ends in a space far more unsettling, a space where the truth is visible, yet never formally acknowledged. For nearly 4 decades, the facts surrounding her death have existed in fragments. Some are written in official records. Others live in private testimonies, whispered accounts, and documents never entered into evidence. Together, they form a narrative that challenges the version of events the world was asked to accept. Julie was not reckless. She was not careless. She did not wander blindly into danger. She was experienced, cautious, and deliberate. Her disappearance did not follow the pattern of an accident. The condition of her vehicle, the placement of the emergency message, the absence of natural explanations, and the evidence of deliberate burning all point toward human involvement. Someone intervened in her journey. Someone controlled the outcome. What followed was not a search for justice, but a series of decisions that slowly buried the truth. Investigations were redirected, reports were rewritten, evidence was mishandled or ignored, witnesses were discouraged from speaking, and when suspicion edged too close to powerful figures, the momentum abruptly stopped. Julie Ward became more than a victim. She became a test of integrity. John Ward spent the rest of his life refusing to let that test be forgotten. He sacrificed comfort, wealth, and peace in pursuit of answers. He crossed oceans, confronted authority, and documented what others would not. He did not win in court, but he changed the story. Because of him, Julie's death is no longer remembered as an unfortunate accident in the African wilderness. It is recognized as a deeply troubling case marked by inconsistencies, interference, and unanswered questions. Even now, the truth remains within reach, close enough to be felt, yet never officially grasped. And perhaps that is the most haunting part of all. Julie Ward's case reminds us that justice does not always fail loudly. Sometimes it fails quietly, behind closed doors, through silence and delay. But stories like hers endure, because silence is not the same as forgetting. As long as her name is spoken, as long as her story is told, the case is not truly closed. And if you believe that stories like Julie's deserve to be heard, remembered, and questioned, make sure to like this video, comment your thoughts below, and subscribe to the Criminal Schema for more in-depth true crime cases, cold case investigations, and stories that refuse to fade into silence. Because awareness keeps cases alive. And justice begins with remembering.